Good morning, colleagues. We might ask Tarika to kick us off. Tarika, over to you.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, thank you all. Good morning and afternoon to all joining from different parts of the world. You have joined the session Water, Communities and Climate Adaptation, which is part of the series of presentation on the Indo-Pacific Water and Climate Day hosted by Australian Water Partnership, Alluvium and Monash University. For this session, I am Tarika Gulati. I will be your facilitator. I am working as a water resources specialist with Alluvium and currently based in India. I work on integrated water management projects, including monitoring and evaluation of projects and programs, along with facilitating capacity building programs and stakeholder engagement. For this session, we have presenters from Nepal, India, and Thailand, who will be presenting a range of learning across South Asia, from policy development to community-based approaches, providing valuable insights into urban resilience in the region. I welcome you all to this session, and we have some interesting presentations lined up in the last session of this Indo-Pacific Water and Climate Day. Can I please request the slides to be brought up? Thank you. So firstly, we will go with some housekeeping rules. So these sessions are recorded and they are also live streamed as well on YouTube and Water for Climate Pavilion website. You would notice that all the participants are muted. However, the chat function is on. I would really appreciate if you have any questions for the presenters during their presenting, please put in the chat box. I'll keep an eye on it, and we'll have a Q&A session once all the three presenters have presented their presentation. And if you could write the speaker's name to whom the question is addressed to, that would be helpful as well. So for this session, we have presenters who will be presenting for 10 minutes each. I will introduce each speaker as soon as their presentation is up. So first speaker is Dr. Kapil Gravali. He's a civil engineer with 16 years of working experience, specializing in hydrology, water resources, irrigation, climate change impacts, and adaptation. He is currently a senior divisional hydrologist at the Water and Energy Commission Secretariat, WEX, the government of Nepal. He would be presenting on the response strategy for water resources management. Over to you, Dr. Kapil, to kick off the presentation.
Thank you, Tarika. Am I listening? Good morning to all. Today, I will talk about Nepal's water resource management challenges along with the impact of climate change on water resource management. Also, I will talk on how Nepal is going to respond to the climate change for water resource management. Please, next slide. You may know Nepal is Indo with water resources, but with skewed temporal and spatial distribution, managing the water across the sectors, upstream and downstream, across the scales, protecting and balancing the environment are the major challenges in water resource management. If you see annual water availability of Nepal, that is over 225 billion cubic meters, and less than 10% of it has been harnessed so far. Also, if we see the hydropower production, just less than 3% of production is harnessed so far. For irrigation, 30% of arable land is irrigated, and almost 22% of annual groundwater has been utilized so far. So also crop productivity is low. Federal structure and integrated approach of management are the governance challenges in water resource management of the Nepal. Please, next slide. Although Nepal emits less than 0.06% of the global total greenhouse gas emission, annual maximum temperature is increasing by 0.05 degrees centigrade per year. Recent studies are showing that the Himalaya is going to be hotter by at least 0.3 to 0.7 degrees centigrade than the atmospheric temperature. It means if the temperature limit is maintained at 1.5 degrees centigrade as per the Paris Agreement, Himalayan temperature will reach 1.8 to 2.2 degrees centigrade. If so, about 36% of glaciers will be melted by the end of this century. About 2/3 of glacier mass has already been lost from the Himalaya. So overall water availability will increase for a few years, but will decrease by the end of 21st century. Water scarcity has already been noticed in snow-fed rivers. Particularly in the hydropower generation has already been affected. Furthermore, water sources are drying up, settlements are displaced due to the water scarcity. So climate change is a reality in Nepal, and warming is higher in mountain and Himalayan regions, which has increased weather extremes, and monsoon is becoming unpredictable. Please, next slide. In the recent years, impact of climate change in water resources have been realized at all levels, that is in the political, decision and policy making levels. Climate vulnerable communities have experienced it in the last decade. Loss of human lives, property and natural resources have increased each year due to climate and water-induced disasters. If we see the trend of climate hazards in Nepal, there is significant increasing trend in climate hazard, especially after 90s. Major climatic hazards are flood and landslide. The number of reported climate hazards have increased from 1971 to till now. Please, next slide. In the last 50 years, Nepal has suffered from more than 3,400 flood events and more than 3,700 landslide events. When flood event increases, landslide event also increases, and vice versa. But in Nepal, both the events show in increasing trend. Please, next slide. If we see the impact of climate change, we have suffered from frequent flooding, landslide, and drought across the country. One of the recent major flood event was Kagyeni Mustang, which lies in Himalayan region, which happened on 30th August 2023. Major impact of that flooding were it washed away about 29 houses and displaced more than 150 people. Economic loss was around USD 7.4 million. Please, next slide. In July 2024, Western Nepal recorded its highest rainfall ever, 624 mm in 24 hours. Previous highest record was around 560 mm. In last September 29, 2024, rain breaks 54-year-old record in Kathmandu Valley. That is 24 hours, whereas the highest record was so far 177 millimeter, which was recorded in 2002. At that event, more than 215 people, including 35 children, have been killed after heavy rains, triggered flash floods, and landslide across the country. Please, next slide. Nepal also faces a growing hazard from glacier lake outburst flood globes. There are over 25,000 glacial lakes in the Hindu Kush Himalayan region, of which 47 are considered as potentially dangerous lakes. Nepal is believed to contain more than 1,000 glacier lakes. Snow melting and expansion of glacier lakes with possible globes, glacier retreating, avalanches, extreme weather-induced flash floods, and landslides are the major and most devastating climate-induced phenomena in the recent years. Impact and consequences of such events are on all economic sectors, such as agriculture, hydropower, irrigation, and other infrastructure, also tourism, forest, and urban areas as well. Water-dependent sectors are more vulnerable to the climate change. A total of 45 reported and unreported historical globe events happened from the 39 glacier lakes across the Nepal. Recent globes were one of the Thame and another was Botikosi. During the thermic gulf, about 14 houses were destroyed and many people were displaced. And in the Botikosi gulf, one hydropower, Botikosi hydropower was swept away. Please, next slide. So, so the observed impact induced challenges on water resource management are rising temperature, which is causing glaciers to sink and enhance glacier melting. Also, it has increasing runoff in short term, but likely to decrease in long term from glaciated rivers. Changes in precipitation pattern, that is high intensity rainfall, number of rainy days decreasing in mountain and monsoon and non-monsoon seasons. Flash flood and landslide in hill and mountains. Flood inundation and river aggregating in the plain areas. Water-induced disasters has increased in magnitude and extent. For the water managers, too little and too much water are the major challenges. Also, river flow with high seasonal variations in the is the major challenge to manage water supply for drinking, irrigation, energy production, and also conserving biodiversity and ecosystem. Please, next slide. You may know Nepal adopted integrated water resource management approach since 2002 through the Water Resource Strategy, National Water Plan 2005, and National Water Resource Policy 2020. But their implementation is notably weak, particularly due to the lack of financial resources. In 2021, Nepal prepared VRA, Vulnerability Risk Assessment, which provides update on climate-related hazards with a clear picture on high water and drought-prone areas based on annual rainfall and extreme climate events. In 2022, we prepared IWRM action plan to expedite the activities to meet the target of SDG 6.5.1. My organization, Water and Energy Commission Secretariat, we call OX, which is responsible for policy formulation, coordination, and legal support on water resource management, has recently prepared the river basin plans of whole country, which considers river basin as a management unit to manage water resource through IWRM approach and make the river basin climate resilient. Also has led and coordinated the Global Water Leadership Program. From these three barriers in water resource management, namely policy implementation, institutional coordination, and data and capacity building, have been prioritized through the multi-stakeholder process. Root causes with corresponding actions also have been prioritized, and an action plan has been prepared. Our response strategy has recently been prepared with the vision of achieving economical and ecological prosperity through the sustainable management and utilization of water, and to promote the development of climate resilient and inclusive water resource policies and plans, and address climate risk opportunities through the climate policies. The strategy is sufficiently linked with the ongoing processes, national priorities, and commitments on water sector, and also promotes the water resource management based on integrated water resource management approach. The whole process ensures the multi-stakeholder consultations. So in nutshell, we can say that effective implementation of this strategy is expected to make the water resource management inclusive, gender responsive, and climate resilient. Total estimated cost of this strategy for implementation is estimated around USD 52.8 million. To achieve the goal of that strategy, Nepal anticipates financial, technological, and capacity building support from the global community. Please, next slide. Finally, key takeaways of my presentation includes mountainous countries are the water towers, which are being more affected by the climate change, though their contribution is negligible. So I would urge developing countries to further understand the specific needs and circumstances of the mountainous, least developed countries like Nepal, and provide additional funding and technical assistance to our initiatives in water resource management and sustainable utilization. It's the right time that countries should focus on building climate smart water policies and water inclusive climate policies. And my final keyword is regional collaboration, which is crucial in building climate resilient world. So let's make the climate resilient world together. Next slide, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kapil, for sharing Nepal's response and policy development on IWRM. Our next speaker, Mr. Sridat Kamath, is currently serving as the State Project Officer on Disaster Risk Management at UNDP India. He has a master's in disaster management and a special interest in disaster governance, policy, and institutional strengthening. Through the UNDP program, he's helping build urban resilience to natural disasters in flood and heat wave vulnerable cities in the state of Maharashtra and building state-level capacities for effective disaster risk reduction. He will be presenting on mitigating water-related hazards, a case study of Maharashtra. Over to you, Sridhar. You're mute.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Tarika, and a very good morning to all of you. We can just start the presentation. A little brief about the UNDP and its presence in India before we go on to the main presentation. So, as I said, we are present in almost all the states in India and working across a plethora of sectors towards the Sustainable Development Goals. Next slide, please. In this endeavor, we are partnering with almost all the relevant ministries, with the states as well as the central government. Next slide. Very happy to reiterate that we have been a partner for India's G20 presidency, and we are formally engaged in 5 working groups, including disaster risk reduction. Next slide. A snapshot of the recent UNDP engagements with regard to the disaster risk reduction across India, one of which is, of course, in Maharashtra. Next slide. Coming down to the brass tacks now, I'll be talking about urban flood mitigation in these 3 cities where we are working, namely Nagpur, Nashik, and Chhatrapati Sambhajinagar. All of these 3 cities are upcoming cities in the state of Maharashtra, highly populated, industrialized, and urbanized. And all 3 are heavily affected by urban floods. You can go on to the next slide, please. A little bit about the risk profile of all these 3 cities before I move on. Nashik, of course, is a world-famous city with a population of 2 million. It is located on the banks of one of the major rivers in India, that is the Godavari. It is prone to urban flooding, as you can see on the slide. It has been hit by urban floods of a major nature in 2008, 16, 19, and 22. And these are major events. There are small events that happen across the city almost every year. It plays host to the very famous Kumbh Mela, which is the largest religious gathering across the world, which invites around more than 20 to 30 million pilgrims, which is almost 5 times the city's population once every 4 years. Nagpur, of course, is the second capital of Maharashtra with a population of 2.5 million. It is the Nag River runs across the city. The name of the city, Nagpur, is derived from the Nag River, and which is also prone to urban flooding. Chhatrapati Sambhajinagar is a bit of an anomaly. It falls within the rain shadow region of the state. However, the Kham River, which runs through the city, which is a seasonal river, often causes urban flooding. So I'll be talking about that as well. We can move on to the next slide, please. Well, the overall objective of the study was to conduct hydrodynamic modeling of the 3 rivers, which I just mentioned, using various predictive modeling technologies, including HECRAS and 2D modeling software. Doing this, we were to develop flood hazard maps, demarcating low-lying areas, and develop and identify the actual pinpoint infrastructure at risk and assess social, environmental, and economic vulnerabilities. The next objective was to develop contextual flood risk mitigation strategies, identify key priorities where we could make meaningful interventions in terms of mitigation. And finally, develop a broad investment plan for prioritized interventions and conduct detailed capacity assessment. Next slide, please. A little bit on the methodology. The overall methodology constituted of us reassessing the red and blue lines for the high flood level as were demarcated by the state government, which are the lines for indicating the 25 and 100-year return flood periods. A detailed study of the topography, the land use, land cover changes, soil characteristics was done. We also did, as I mentioned, use HECRAS models for determining the return periods of the floods, and intensity, duration, frequency curves were used, and return periods for 2, 5, 10, 25, 50, and 100-year return periods for floods were studied. And finally, the cross-section surveys of rivers in each of these cities was conducted at a very, very minute level to actually assess the vulnerability of the city to the floods. Next slide. The outcomes of the study were demarcated flood chronic spots. And by flood chronic spots, I mean not just low-lying areas, but areas that were not really identified as flood chronic spots before, but now came across surprisingly as chronically flooding spots because of the study. Identified vulnerable infrastructure system at a ward level. Now, ward is an administrative structure that is done at the city level. We developed 2D flood maps, as I mentioned, and inundation maps for various return periods at the ward level, and the flood inundation maps show what level spread at what depth and at what level of rainfall, how much flooding will happen, what will be the depth of the flooding at various points in the city. All of this came across very, very clearly through the study. And finally, we developed an official modeling website or a portal that would help the decision makers to take decisions and simulate floods at various levels to see what kind of mitigation should be done, and also what kind of development should be done in the future based on the outcomes of the study. Next slide, please. I'm just going to briefly touch upon various maps to actually show you what was the outcome of this study. So this is a map for, again, Chhatrapati Sambhajinagar, which I'll be elaborating upon. The flood risk assessment for infrastructure this is for a 25 return year period simulation map, where you can very clearly see the areas that will be flooded and what will be the level of flooding and the depth of the inundation as well. Next slide. Now, this is a very clear, we used the survey data to actually see what is really causing the flooding. And you can very clearly see here, which the outlined in red, the B and C sections, the river width has gone down massively over a period of the last few years, wherein structures have sprung up around the length and the breadth of the river, narrowing it down and thereby reducing the carrying capacity massively, which is resulting in urban flooding, even though this is a rain shadow region, as I mentioned. Next slide. We came out with structural as well as non-structural mitigation measures for the study, which included construction of retaining walls, modification of the calm river at certain locations, creation of detention basins or percolation tanks in the upstream of the Harshul Lake, and also some non-structural measures such as demarcation of flood buffers, creation of an early flood warning system, and all of this. I'll be talking about all of this in detail as we go on. Next slide, please. Now, this was about the modification of the Kham River bed at certain sections, when very clearly, as I mentioned, there is a lake called the Harshul Lake, which is at the upstream. And the study very clearly told us that the river bed will have to be modified at pinpointed locations in order to ensure that the habitations do not get flooded and the rainwater gets inundated at some place without habitation, so that the people are not affected. Next slide. Now, this map very clearly shows the pinpointed locations wherein here the water can be gathered in case of an overflow from the Harshul Lake. As can be seen from the slide, the Harshul Lake has a huge massive carrying capacity of 120 cusecs as compared to the carrying capacity of the river, which is just 70 cumecs. So when the overflow begins from the Harshul Lake after rainfall, the study tells us exact areas where structures can be created for that water to accumulate, so that the habitations across the city with vulnerable people are not flooded and people are then safe. Next slide. Coming down to the development of a web application, we actually have an open source web application which we have prepared along with Alluvium itself, with various features which allow for the decision makers of the city to have various characteristics to simulate floods at various levels of rainfall, so that they can actually find out which areas of the city will be flooded at what levels of rainfall, to ensure that the response is very effective. At the same time, the web application in the future will also allow the decision makers to ensure that development that is carried out in the future is sustainable and safe, and not in the zones that are actually vulnerable to flooding. Next slide, please. This is another snapshot of the web application, which very clearly shows us what kind of characteristics and utility the web application has for the decision makers. They can use various characteristics to simulate floods and overlay it with various layers of infrastructure, government buildings, all kind of public utilities, to see what kind of inundation will happen and affect what kind of utilities, so that measures can be taken to counteract that. Next slide. Now, this is a brief snapshot of some other cities. This is the flood vulnerability maps that we have come out for Nashik, which shows the slums or the highly vulnerable population of Nashik that will be affected at what level of inundation at what level of rainfall? Next slide, please.
Hi,
Coming down to the
Sridhar.
actual, I'm sorry, I'll just take 1 minute. I'll just take 1 minute.
Yeah.
These were the
Yes,
actual
definitely.
outcome and concrete recommendations for all 3 cities. Now, the outcome of the study was to come down with very pinpointed recommendation for the 3 cities, which are on the slides, as you can see, which gave the decision makers and the administration of all the cities to take measures. Next slide. Very, very happy to tell you that based on this effort from the UNDP along with its partners, we have actually managed to initiate this by drawing funds from the 15th Finance Commission of the central government, because any study laying in a dusty corner of the office does not make sense. We have actually managed to create very detailed DPRs and to submit to the government, and funds have been released for taking up these mitigation measures. Next slide. This is for Chhatrapati Sambhajinagar, a snapshot of the government resolution. And this is again for Nagpur, where the more than 500 crores rupees have been released to take up all these mitigation measures, just to ensure that we do this to make cities safer and in the future ensure that all development is actually sustainable in the real sense of the term. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sridhar, for the great work that has been happening in Maharashtra and sharing the learnings and the work with us. I just want to remind everyone that you can use the chat function to put in your questions. We have some questions already present there. If the speakers would like to answer there, or there, it would be okay. Otherwise, we'll take in the Q&A session after our third speaker has presented. So the third speaker would be Ms. Ananya Bhatia from Asian Disaster Preparedness Center, ADPC. She's an urban planner specializing in urban development, climate research, remote sensing, and GIS applications. She's based in Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam, and she currently works as a consultant with ADPC Bangkok. She has contributed to various climate adaptation initiatives across South Asian cities, including heat action planning in India, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh. She will be presenting on addressing urban heat vulnerability in South Asian cities, community-based approaches, and climate resilience. Ananya.
Thank you, Tarika, for your kind introduction. Good morning, everyone. Followed by the insightful presentations by Sridhar and Kapil. In this session, I'll be sharing some thoughts on addressing the growing challenge of urban heat vulnerability in the South Asian cities. Next, please. So as we've seen, extreme heat events in the region reached over 50 degrees Celsius this year. And the problem is going to intensify as the urbanization continues to increase. 75% children in South Asia, as compared to 33% children globally, they are facing extreme heat. And women's heat vulnerability is increased by physiological factors, limited access to resources, and their increased caregiver duties, especially in the South Asian subcontinent. The critical impacts are seen on health, productivity, livelihood, vulnerable groups, water, electricity, among others. Next, please. So the link between urbanization and increased urban heat is very clear. And as our population increases, our needs increase, the vulnerable groups like women, children, the homeless, among others, are disproportionately impacted. So the evidence is clear from some of the pictures across South Asia you see on this slide. You can see some women in Jacobabad, Pakistan, who have to carry drinking water to their homes and who have to travel a great distance. And in Rajasthan, a dry state in India, there is a special train which comes in the summer, and the women have to fill their pitchers with the water supplied. Especially in Delhi, where I was working earlier, I have seen people collect drinking water from the tankers in the summers. Next, please. So we've seen how this urban heat crisis is directly linked to the water crisis, with urban heat affecting water availability and quality, and water playing a critical role in heat resilience solutions. Next, please. So we did some research alongside Integrated Research and Action for Development, a think tank in India, on heat action plans in South Asian cities. And these are some of the publications which came out of it. Next, please. So we followed this framework on climate adaptive heat action plans, where we did extensive research covering the literature study, the climatological variance in the city, the heat island mapping using GIS and remote sensing, the dynamic vulnerability assessment, and we also did some surveys which identified the vulnerable groups and hotspots. The assessment of heat impact on health, productivity, and livelihood of the people, which was based on the surveys and our maps. And we also tried to develop sector-wise mitigation and adaptation strategies, which can be followed pre, during, and post the heat waves. And we tried to ensure that the city and state level stakeholders and the community is always engaged in the whole process. And this was followed by the dissemination of the results. And we also uh, took care that the results are also available in the local languages. Next, please. So quickly showing you some heat hotspot maps we developed for various cities. And then we did surveys in some of these identified hotspots. Next, please. So our field studies in Bhubaneswar, Surat, Rajkot, Delhi in India, Colombo in Sri Lanka, and Rajshahi in Bangladesh have really highlighted the water heat nexus. In Bhubaneswar, we mapped the vulnerability of the hotspots facing water crisis during the peak summers, and 7 out of 10 identified hotspot wards were facing high vulnerability due to the lack of water supply. Next, please. So similarly in Surat, you can see some charts here, and we saw how the households are struggling with limited access to water, having to rely on private suppliers or store water in various makeshift containers. And this also led to many vector-borne disease later on. And with a 95% increase in household water consumption during the heat waves, the strain on the system was very severe. Next, please. Okay, so amidst these challenges, we have also seen the power of community-centered solutions and ward-level heat action plans, community participation in vulnerability assessments, the integration of traditional cooling practices. These are the kind of interventions that are making a real difference on the ground. And IRADE research saw many wins, like the Rajkot Municipal Corporation. They lowered the heat wave alert threshold by 0.5 degrees Celsius. And the research was also endorsed by the National Disaster Management Authority, World Meteorological Organization, and World Health Organization. And the ward level action plans are already implemented in Rajkot, Bhubaneswar, and Delhi. And the demonstrations have been carried on in Surat, Rajshahi, and Colombo. Odisha State Disaster Management Authority, they also revised their policy, and more than 300 medical professionals, including the doctors, they were trained on heat-related illnesses. And of course, there are hurdles to overcome, like we had limited heat mortality data and some funding constraints were also there. But the benefits were very clear, and these approaches help to prevent heat-related deaths, reduced illnesses, and make our cities more resilient. Next, please. So as we look ahead to COP29, I believe there are some key policy recommendations that need to be on the table. We need a framework that integrates heat action into urban planning and nature-based solutions, mandates vulnerability assessments, and ensure meaningful community participation. And the financial mechanisms to support this, dedicated heat resilience funds, public-private partnerships, community level microfinancing, these will be very crucial in the coming times. And ultimately, the relevance to the COP29 agenda should be very clear to all of us. We need to see urban heat as a central focus in the NDCs of the countries, with city level actions targets and cross border knowledge sharing. And the financing solutions, loss and damage considerations, support for community led adaptation strategies, these will be essential for building a heat resilient, sustainable, and equitable future. Next, please. So, in closing, the key takeaways are very clear. The community centered approaches, they always work. Technology integration is very important, and the regional collaboration. These all are essential for building our resilient communities. And as we move forward, scaling successful interventions, strengthening the partnerships, and enhancing monitoring systems, it will be critical next steps. Next, please. So we have two future scenarios, one which focuses on the GDP and one which focuses on the SDGs. And we have to decide what we want. Thank you.
Thanks, Ananya, for sharing perspectives and research around urban heat and how community-centric approaches are really important to look at, as well as policy. We do have some questions in the Q&A section. I'll just go one by one and we'll address it to the speaker. So first question is for you, Kapil. A participant has asked, with regard to regional collaboration, do you have plans to engage with India on conservation of mountainous and Terai region in Nepal, which have co-benefits for India?
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. Yes, of course, we always want to collaborate with India because our rivers are transboundary natures. Our rivers start from the China and comes to Nepal, then goes to India. Of course, we cannot work alone. So we always prefer and we always recommend for the transboundary cooperation. So of course, we are also having conversation with Indian side. We have several committees, like we have Joint Committee on Water Resources, which sits every year and discuss about the transboundary issues like the mountain issue and flooding issues like those. And also we do have another joint committee on flood management also we have. During the flood, we also meet together. So we always prefer, and we are also doing the joint meetings and collaboration. So eager to do more collaboration with Indian side and also with China also, because our rivers are touching 3 countries. Thank you very much for the question.
Thank you, Kapil. The next question is for Sridhar. Are you considering catchment interventions in the Harshul Lake catchment? And the participant is just curious, that is the Nashik Kumbh Mela larger than the Sangam Kumbh Mela in general? You're muted, Sridhar.
Yeah, I'll answer the second part first, maybe because that's a shorter answer. No, it's not. The Nashik Kumbh Mela is a relatively smaller one in terms of, because it's the Kumbh, and the one at Prayagraj is the biggest Kumbh, which is the Mahakumbh. But both of them relatively attract more than around 20 to 30 million pilgrims. So that is, so in terms of the holding capacity, it's a very, very big event across the world if you consider it. Now coming back, can you just repeat about the Harshul Lake? What was the question?
So the question was, are you considering catchment interventions in the Harshul Lake catchment?
No, we have actually, if you go back to the slide, you can see that we have described about the carrying capacity of both the Harshul Lake and the Kham River. So any spill off that will happen from the Harshul Lake, we have identified spots along the Kham River for which will serve as repositories of this water along areas that are uninhabited, so that the habitations do not get inundated. This is a very pinpointed intervention that we have proposed.
Yeah. Thank you. And there's another question regarding engaging local communities and other stakeholders for you, Kapil, in Nepal. How does VEX ensure that local perspectives are effectively included in water governance and policy development?
Thank you for the question. My presentation's focus was on the stakeholder consultation, because we prepared the response strategy based on extensive stakeholder consultation from the beginning to the end of the beginning to the end, because we initially identified the stakeholders from the variety of sectors, like not only in the water sector but also in the from the agriculture and forestry, as well as the local communities. We identified about more than 50 stakeholders from the variety of institutions and committees, and they sit together and identified the what would be the barriers in the water resource management. And they meet every month for 2 years. And initially they identify the barrier, then next step they identified what would be the root cause of those barriers. Then they identified the action plans to cope the issues, and the action plan was prepared by themselves. And finally they prepared the response strategy with financial plan. So we just facilitate from the works, but they themselves prepared. So we involve all the local communities, like we invited municipality representatives, provincial representatives, and also from the bank and NGO, many more. So we always prefer to engage stakeholders. So that document was also prepared from the stakeholder engagement. It was from the stakeholders, so it was just owned by us. Thank you, Tarika, for the question.
Thank you so much. That's really interesting of how the co-design of that whole process worked out.
Also, I would like
we do.
Also, I would like what would be the implementation strategy like this? We also have proposed implementation strategy of that response strategy. We would form National Water Resource Coordination Committee, which will guide how to go ahead, because the strategy was prepared from the stakeholders, so they already own that strategy. They will include their activities within their fiscal budgets, and already it has already been implemented. It started already, so it has already owned and already is ongoing to implementation. So it's like an example for the for preparing other documents as well. Thank you very much.
Definitely. Yeah, thank you so much. We do have some time, and I was curious when I was listening and deliberating on the presentations, if I could ask Sridhar and Ananya one question each. So Sridhar, with the development of the web-based application that you showed as an outcome, it has huge impacts on the stakeholders that are present in the flood-prone areas. Is there any planning or thought around sharing the findings with the relevant stakeholders, because some will have a bigger impact than the others as part of this project?
So thank you for that question, Tarika, because time was short. I could not really dwell much upon the presentation also. But just to add a couple of things which I think will make the picture a bit clearer. We are not just doing the flood modeling study in isolation. We are also at the same time carrying out a very, very detailed hazard risk vulnerability assessment for all of these three cities, which will give us much more layers regarding economic, financial, social, as well as economic vulnerability, as well as environmental vulnerability at the ground level. And all these layers, when superimposed upon the portal, which will give a much clearer picture to the decision makers with regard to what kind of people at what levels of the disaster will be affected to what degree. So that makes the picture much more clearer. Secondly, in the future, we also plan to open up this portal to the public themselves. All those people at the ground who will be hit by floods will have open access to the portal sometime in the future, wherein they can themselves decide about the decisions that they take with regard to the disaster. For example, if I'm considering buying a house, I'll actually look at the plot myself, the plot that I'm considering to buy, to see what kind of flooding this particular spot is vulnerable to ensure that I take the right decision in the future with regard to housing and all other decisions as well. So this is a very open portal that we're actually planning to give to all the relevant stakeholders and eventually to general public as well.
And I assume the state government and the city governments are on board with sharing this information?
Eventually, yes. As of now, it's still in the testing phases, as I told. But once the decision makers are through with it, then yes, in the long run, yes, this plasma is on board.
Okay, great. I think to make an informed decision, these kind of intervention, these kind of project work has to reach to the relevant stakeholders. So thank you so much. Just last question, if there's none in the chat or in the Q&A one, to you, Ananya. So how are community-centric approaches tied at the policy level? So you talked a lot about the research on urban heat and how the impact and what the nexus of water and urban heat and the community approaches really work. But how do we tie the ground approaches and innovations, and how are they supported or linked to any policy development? Because eventually, if we have to take them further, we need to have a concrete way forward for that. So just your reflection on that in the South Asian cities.
Thank you for the question, Tarika. So, as you mentioned, the community-centric approaches, they are often tied to policy development. We tried to engage the participatory methods and collaborative governance during my research with IRADE. And these methods ensure that the local communities are actively involved in the decision-making processes, which helps to create the policies that are more relevant and effective and can be implemented on the ground and not just our reports. So the policies should include specific provisions to support the grassroots innovations. And we also need funding for the local projects, especially capacity building initiatives and the frameworks that encourage community-led solutions. So IRADE successfully implemented ward-level heat action plans in the cities. And this was not just a top-down approach. It was built on real community insights and experiences. And we also saw the community policy connection through various funding channels. Our work was supported by major institutions like IDRC, UK Aid, and APN, Asia Pacific Network. So we've been particularly successful with our grassroots micro grants as well, which specifically focus on developing the community-led templates for the disaster management. And in terms of innovation support, I'll see that we are seeing encouraging policy developments that support the community level solutions. And this includes a mechanism for public-private partnerships, community level microfinancing. What is particularly heartening about the situation is the integration of the indigenous knowledge into the formal planning processes. So while in Surat, we got to know that some women, they read about that painting the roofs of your house could lead to the cooling of your rooms by 2 degrees or something. So they actually did that on their own, and they saw results, and they were very happy to share it with us. And so we tried to move towards genuine bottoms up planning approach. However, we face some challenges at the policy level, and our measurement systems for heat stress threshold, it remains very basic, and we lack comprehensive records of heat related mortality and morbidity. So we did like this was a challenge getting the data and then vetting the data as well. And these are some of the areas where we need stronger policy support. So I think, yes, maybe I was able to address some questions. Thank you.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Ananya. And I would really like to thank all the speakers of this session. It really provided a great insight into what is happening in South Asia and urban resilience, and what we should be doing. I would just like to for closing or for summarizing the session, I would like to welcome Sarah Ransom, the General Manager, AWP, to summarize the session. And over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Tarika, and a very big thank you to our panelists. We've had a really interesting session today, and I really thank you for your time and for sharing your expertise with all of the participants here today. Just briefly summarising from my perspective, Dr. Kapil from Nepal, was really interesting to hear your presentation about the special vulnerability of Nepal and also mountain countries more generally, vulnerability to climate change, and some of the challenges that you face in managing water across different timescales and sectoral uses as well as geographies, and you described that as challenging. We heard from you, and I think this is something that other speakers have said throughout the day today, that climate change will increase water scarcity and drive disasters. I think that's fairly common across the countries that we've looked at through the session today. And you spoke about floods and landslides and gloughs, and I didn't know that there were 1,000 glacial lakes in Nepal, so that was interesting and a big challenge to manage there. You spoke about the challenge also as being around too much water and too little water. And I think, again, that's a message that we've heard across our various speakers today as well. That's how climate change is manifesting through that's disruption to the hydrological cycle. You also spoke about your work with river basin management, and I thought that was quite interesting, the way that you presented your river basin management work as an adaptation to climate change. It's quite an interesting way to frame that issue. And also you spoke about the importance of inclusive approaches, including gender responsive, and you finished with a very strong call for collaboration and partnerships, which we really appreciated. Shudat, thank you also for your presentation. It was wonderful to listen to your work. You're right in there doing some fantastic work around flood mitigation across Maharashtra. It was really interesting to hear the details of that work and how successful you've been linking pilots to policy, which is, again, a challenge that many face. Many good pilots out there, but making the case to government for these to be incorporated into policy is a particularly special skill, and I think you've done a fantastic job there. I'd really like to hear your discussion about the importance of data, generating data and communicating data, and how important that is for individuals making decisions about where they might live. It's important to planners who are making decisions about how flood-prone areas of the city may be used, and more broadly as well about the impacts on critical infrastructure and critical services throughout the urban environments. And also, you spoke about the impacts on informal settlements, which I thought was really interesting as well, because we know in many places informal settlements tend to be built in places that do have higher flood risk. So making that information available broadly to the public is a very big potential good that you can provide. I'll move on to Ananya. Thank you also for your presentation. It was wonderful to hear about the work that ADPC has been doing on urban heating. And I think this is an issue which is incredibly important. And as we know, more people across the world are moving into urban environments. And I think urban heating will be something that touches many people, as it already is, but in future, potentially more. You spoke about your climate adaptive heat action framework and spoke about the process that you used, including GIS mapping, but also it sounded like some really great community level engagement, data collection, but also it sounds like you were able to use different types of knowledges and different forms of knowledge. You spoke about Indigenous people and women and users, and that's a really interesting approach that you can provide a framework for all those different knowledge types to be incorporated into decision making and also in your work influencing policymakers. And you also spoke quite passionately about the special vulnerabilities of certain groups in societies to urban heating. And I think that this event, part of COP29, we always need to keep remembering that. Those voices need to be part of the decisions that are made. Children and poorer people, people who are unhoused, and women in particular who have particular vulnerabilities to urban heating. So thank you for that. Just to pick up a couple of themes that I drew out from all of the presentations today. There's some really interesting work going on around community-centred interventions and planning through consultation processes in the case of WEX, but also in terms of making information available to empower people to make their own decisions, and like in Ananya's presentation, treating information that comes from community as an important input into models and scientific decision making as well. You all made a call for collaboration, and that came through the work that you're all doing on policy leadership, and you emphasise the importance of developing climate smart and water inclusive policies, not only domestically but also across the region. So that's something that we're really pleased that we've been able to do today, is to provide opportunities to share information and approaches across the various regions. And finally, yeah, I just wanted to make a note that cities keep popping up, and we've had this conversation throughout the day as well. Many conversations about the importance of cities when it comes to climate smart water management. So that's been something that came up through the presentations today, and the importance of space to share information and share regional learnings. So again, this brings us back here to COP today. I'll thank the panelists again. It's really been wonderful, and look forward to working with you all in future. We were going to close the session now and move across to our live cross. We have our colleagues Sandy Swanson from Monash University who will take us forward for this live session. But for now, we'll close the session. I'll pop back up at the start to introduce Sandy properly, but thank you to all our South Asia panelists once again.
Thank you.